Hey everyone, welcome back to This is a Woman podcast. Welcome to episode 40. My governor is running for vice president. As a woman, here's what I think. This episode is with Becca Delahunt and Renee Carlson from the Minnesota Family Policy Council, and we are going to just dive in to all the facts, all the truth behind, is Governor Tim Walz a pro-woman candidate? This election, there's been a lot of talk about this person's anti-woman, this person's pro-woman because of abortion, because of pro-life, because of gender ideology. Are we allowing men in girls' bathrooms and locker rooms? Are we not? And so that has been such a main focus of this election. And two great friends of mine, again, Becca and Renee, do what I do, but instead of in California, they do it in Minnesota. Renee is a lawyer. Becca is a lead charge of the policy at the Minnesota Family Council. So I want you guys to hear directly from them what Governor Walz has done in Minnesota, and is it pro-woman or not? So with that, let's dive into it. Women are currently being erased in culture, and I want to amplify their voices and share their stories. Well, hello, Becca and Renee, and welcome to This is a Woman podcast. We're so excited to have you on today.
It's good to be here with you, Sophia.
Thanks for having us, Sophia.
Yes. Well, as the listeners kind of already know, I gave them a little update that we are going to be diving in today all about what is going on in Minnesota. Also relative to Governor Tim Walz, we see that he is running for VP, and a lot of this election has been circulating around women's issues, women's rights, women's freedom. Yet, I feel like there's a lot of people that are not sure which side is actually the pro-woman side, which candidates are actually the pro-woman candidates. And so that's why I wanted you guys to come in today and say firsthand what you've seen on the ground in Minnesota and the bills that have been signed into law and what's kind of been happening in Governor Tim Walz's state. So before we get into everything, why don't you give the listeners a little clip about who you are and what you do? So Renee, let's kick off with you.
My name is Renee Carlson, and I work for True North Legal as our general counsel. True North Legal is an initiative of the Minnesota Family Council. And at True North Legal, we work to protect and defend life, family, and religious freedom here in the state of Minnesota. We do that through three ways, through education, working on public policy, and litigation in the courts. So it's good to be here with you and good to be here with my friend Becca Delahunt at Minnesota Family Council. I also do serve at times as a lobbyist for the Minnesota Family Council, so wear a couple of different hats, but it's great to be here.
Amazing. Rebecca.
I'm Becca Delahunt. I work in public policy with Minnesota Family Council as a director, so I'm a lobbyist. I work at our state legislature with Renee on issues pertaining to life, family, and religious freedom. And so issues are really aligned with Sophia's interests in California. We're really excited today to talk about how we stand for protecting women and children, and how Governor Walz has really not done that and done the opposite of that.
Amazing. Well, for all of you that are listening, that you know what I do for work, you're familiar with the stuff and the bills that I bring to you all from California, I hope you guys also know that I never over exaggerate on what the legislation is. I want to just make it clear on what it is. And that's why I've brought Becca and Renee on today, because I trust them with the exact same. We're not going to sit here and over exaggerate or lie or do things. We're just going to bring you the truth of what is going on the ground in Minnesota, what Governor Walz has signed into law, what he's allowed to happen in his state. And so everything we talk about, all the legislation we talk about, there will be links in the show notes. So go ahead and check out those if you want to read through legislation yourself, if you want to kind of do a deep dive. But we're going to go through all that today. We're really going to focus in on the two main women issues we see pop up in the news right now: abortion and the transgender ideology, because both of these do affect women. If you listen to the podcast frequently, you know we've had doctors on about abortion. We've had women that have had abortions on and talked about their regrets from there and how they've had healing through that. So if you've listened to other episodes, you're very familiar with the idea that abortion is not pro-women. Being pro-life is being pro-women. So let's kick off with the whole abortion topic of what's happened in Minnesota. Becca, there's been a lot of movement since Roe v. Wade on abortion in Minnesota. Get us up to date with what's going on there.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, right after the Roe v. Wade decision, which came through the Dobbs decision in summer 2022, Minnesota's legislature went full blue. So the DFL controlled both the state house and the state senate. I should note, Sophia, the DFL is our Democratic Party, Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. And right out of the gate, their first priority was to grant a fundamental right to abortion in our state laws. So they passed that through House File 1, Senate File 1, the so-called Protect Reproductive Options Act, which states that every individual in Minnesota has a fundamental right to so-called reproductive health care. Now, within that, they include abortion, which of course is never care, but they also include contraception, sterilization, and fertility services. It was pretty open-ended. And so they really opened the Pandora's box, which is wild considering that they granted a fundamental right in state law. But that was really incredible and frankly barbaric, as it's not aligned with most Western nations on this issue. It's actually aligned with countries like North Korea and China. And they passed it extremely fast, Sophia. They passed it within the first month of the Minnesota legislative session. Governor Walz signed it into law toward the end of January 2023. So it was their first priority, and they made that very clear with the speed at which it passed.
Absolutely. And I want to note on that, I mean, that's what we see here in California with the legislative session. It's January through August. We don't see Governor Newsom start signing bills until the end of that. But very rarely we'll see him come in and sign bills. And we saw that happen in California. Newsom came in during the legislative session and signed a pro-trans ideology parents lying to parents bill and a pro-abortion bill. And so I just want to emphasize what you said there, Becca, on how quickly that bill was passed and signed into law by Governor Walz. That's not the normal process. So they definitely show where their priorities are, and the Minnesota legislature and Governor Walz definitely showed his priority is for abortion by doing that so quickly.
Right.
So we saw that bill, and then what's kind of the next pro-abortion bill? I mean, we've heard, even in some of the debates, we heard Kamala Harris say, hey, abortion isn't happening up to the moment of birth. Babies aren't being born alive and being killed. That's not happening. You guys have a bill that went through and stats that kind of showed the opposite, correct?
Right, Sophia, we actually had a repealer. So following that House File 1 and Senate File 1, we had what we were calling the how-to bill, which is how will Minnesota facilitate unfettered access to abortion on demand? Well, they'll do it with no guardrails. How will they do that? They will repeal essentially every guardrail that was passed in the state of Minnesota. And we're talking about bipartisan legislation that has passed years ago to protect the health of women and young girls seeking an abortion. So you're right, that did include the Infants Born Alive Protection Act. That bill was amended, so it was essentially gutted because it was changed to the extent that no longer is there a mandatory provision in there providing care for infants born alive who survive an abortion. In fact, what's in there now is just comfort care. And we heard from an EMT who testified at the legislature. I was in that committee. I testified at that committee. Becca was there as well, as many of our allies were. So we all heard this. They were explaining and discussing how comfort care is different than life-saving respiratory care. And still the legislature passed that bill. And not only that, they took it out of the reporting requirements. So they did also repeal a ton of requirements that a Minnesota Department of Health used to keep on stat to refer to abortions. And essentially, we felt like they held the abortion industry accountable. So a lot of data and reporting is now gone and not required. But for those who don't think that infants are born alive who survive an abortion here in the state of Minnesota, you can look at the Department of Health's own records where you can see that in 2021, 5 infants were born alive who survived an abortion. In 2019, 3 infants were born alive who survived an abortion. That is according to Walz's own administration. And prior to that, there could be other numbers out there as well. And not only, were those in the repealer, we had the removal of a hospital-only law, providing that abortions happen in the hospital after the 3rd trimester. If you look on the Attorney General's website now, this is Walz administration, Walz Attorney General. He is for telehealth when it comes to abortions. So are we going to be having mifepristone and other dangerous drugs mailed to, let's say, a 12 or a 13-year-old through telehealth, where she is going to have to face having an abortion alone on the bathroom floor? Our women's right to know and informed consent was also washed away. That was repealed. We also had the 24-hour waiting period. That's repealed. Physician-only law to make sure that at least skilled physicians would provide an abortion. That's also repealed. So I've said, as you'll probably hear in my testimony, that now in the state of Minnesota, cattle and reptile have more rights than women and girls and preborn children in the state of Minnesota. That is true. If you look up the animal cruelty statutes, you will see horses, cows, cattle are protected, and reptiles more than Minnesota women, girls, and preborn children. That is astounding. One other thing I'll just add, Sophia, because a lot of moms I know are wondering about parental notification laws. Well, Minnesota had a parental notification law on the books, and that was not included, in the repealer, although it was teed up to be included in that repeal, in that big bill that was passed, the big omnibus bill. They kept that out. However, there was a district court case called Doe v. Minnesota that was tracking with this abortion legislation. And so simultaneously, we had a case that was challenging all these pro-life laws, these guardrails for the abortion industry. Essentially, all of the health and safety regulations were also held unconstitutional by a district court judge. So a number of people, including over 60 mothers who are now part of an association, Mothers Offering Maternal Support, tried to intervene in this lawsuit. They tried to be a part of this lawsuit as sort of a third party because the Attorney General refused to protect the rights of parents and the rights of girls by not adequately defending the parental notification statute. He refused to do that. These moms, unfortunately, were not successful in that attempt. So now we have an unenforceable parental notification law as determined by just a district court, which is also in legal terms kind of astounding. One district court, one county in the state of Minnesota is basically controlling this parental notification law unless other things happen in the legal system. So it is pretty bleak as far as holding the abortion industry accountable and just common sense protections for women and girls who may be seeking an abortion here in the state.
Absolutely. And you noted how horses and reptiles have more rights, more protections than women and babies do now. And so I think that's such an important point. I mean, so often I've been seeing lately on social media this whole picture of, I wish women had as many rights as guns, like acting, and that's like beyond ridiculous. First of all, like, guns can't be near a voting section, but women can go vote. Like, we can go down a list of things how that's so inaccurate. And so I love that you point out, like, now, like, again, these animals, reptiles, all this have more protections than women and babies. And so that's so important to note, to be which side's the pro-woman side, which side's the pro-child side, which side's the pro-family side. I think it's pretty clear. And I do want everyone to kind of check out your testimony. So let's watch that clip from when you testified on this.
Welcome to the committee, and please state your name for the record.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Renee Carlson. I serve as General Counsel for True North Legal. Senate File 70, the how-to manual for Senate File 1, goes far beyond any interpretation of the Minnesota Supreme Court case Doe v. Gomez. It cannot be stated that the court's interpretation of the constitutional right to abortion in Minnesota necessarily implies that all other health and safety regulations regarding abortion are unconstitutional. Yet Senate File 70 eliminates all protections for preborn children, women, and young girls. Senate File 70 repeals the Infants Born Alive Act, thus cattle and reptiles will have more legal protections in Minnesota than Minnesota's vulnerable preborn children. Legal penalties for animal cruelty in Minnesota range from misdemeanor up to a felony, while there is no criminal penalty for leaving a preborn child to die on a cold metal table. Senate File 70 removes criminal penalties for the intentional death of a child resulting from an illegal abortion, regardless of gestation, even if that same child would be the victim of a crime, but for the cause of death
being an abortion. Such a double standard in the law will undoubtedly elicit confusion for policymakers and the courts. Existing health and safety protections regarding who can perform an abortion, where an abortion can be performed, and whether the parents of a minor child will be informed about their young daughter's abortion is also being repealed. Moreover, Minnesota taxpayers will now incur the cost of paying for abortion on demand, something opposed by 58% of Americans. Based on elusive claims about access to abortion and insufficient public notice or debate, Senate File 70 invites inconsistency and confusion of the law, as well as severe legal consequences. It is a radical overhaul of Minnesota's abortion laws and is out of step with the desires of most Minnesotans. Thank you. I encourage you to read my testimony submitted for the record.
Saw something as consequential as wiping off all of the protections on the books, get a little beep, you heard the little beep, beep, beep. So we had, that was a long testimony, actually. That I was allowed, I think, about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. We had times where we'd have very little notice, and we had as much as 90 seconds, perhaps, to testify. And at one period, Sophia, or one committee hearing, there was a question as to whether I properly submitted my name for the record, in which the committee actually debated my integrity in front of me during a live committee meeting. And one of the legislators said, "Excuse me, I hope we're not striking her from the record because of her viewpoint," in which I did testify, and that was, one of the most amazing bios I've ever had before testimony, calling into question my integrity and whether I was truthfully and honestly signing up to testify. So this was very contentious. It was very swift. The process didn't give accurate time for debate. I think that was around January 17th of 2023, and things kept unraveling from there. One other thing I was going to mention before, I think Becca's got a few other things to share, is near the middle of session, we had an opportunity to pass a bill that would have been a slight tax relief on maternal goods. So we're talking about cribs, we're talking about car seats, and other things where, any dollar helps. And there were women that were testifying in committee saying, "I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Just having an extra $20 in my pocket would be so helpful for me and for my family. If I could get this tax relief, please pass this bill." Well, at that point, we also had a $17.6 billion surplus. That's about $1,300 maybe per woman that actually utilizes this or needs these supplies. And I'm thinking, like a couple $1,000,000 probably for the state with a $17.6 billion surplus. Well, that bill didn't pass. And we're hearing a lot about Governor Walz. We're hearing a lot about Coach Walz and Dad Walz. And I can't say that I've met him or know him in the capacity as a coach or as a dad. But what I can say is that if I went to my dad and I was saying, "Dad, I'm living paycheck to paycheck. Can you just give me like $20 for gas or groceries?" My dad would do that. That's our values. That's pro-women. I did not see that happen by Walz or anyone in this administration. I think, the facts speak for themselves, Sophia. People can look at the record and see what kind of administration Walz has, and if he really is pro-women and pro-family.
Absolutely. I think that's so key, because so often the arguments we hear from Walz's party is that the people that are standing up for life don't hate women. They don't help women throughout that pregnancy or post-pregnancy, which we know isn't true. We have amazing pregnancy resource centers. We have some that are licensed medical clinics that provide so much help to women. Like, they provide they'll provide diapers for the baby. They'll provide car seats if needed. They'll provide the things you need. And yet Governor Walz and the Minnesota legislature said no tax relief for maternal goods, proving they really don't care about women through that. Like you said, I don't know what father wouldn't tell his daughter, "Here, you need the $20 for gas. I got you. I'll give it to you." Not just to say they're just going to throw cash around, but when you see your daughter in need, when you see a woman in need, most people will do what they can to help. So it's heartbreaking that we saw that Governor Walz won't even lend a hand to mothers in need. Becca, with that, pregnancy resource centers, like we were talking about, what's been going on there in Minnesota with those?
Absolutely. Well, Minnesota has a number of incredible pregnancy resource centers, some of which are fully privately funded, and then some which have been funded by either the state government grant fund or a mixture of both of those options through something called the Positive Alternatives Grant Program. And in 2023, when all of these sweeping abortion bills were being passed, they cut that program. So advocates for the pro-abortion side were saying, these are fake clinics which are trying to trick women into not getting abortion. And pro-life folks were saying, you say you're the advocates of choice for women, and yet you're cutting this program which allows women to have multiple options. We know that a lot of women need some support. Oftentimes when we're faced with this significant of a decision, if we had some emotional support or a community support coming around us, which is what PRC provide, we would be willing to try to continue with these difficult decisions. And so we were arguing that this takes away options from women. And it was really heartbreaking to hear all these lies shared about pregnancy resource centers. It's also important to note, Sophia, that this came off of our Attorney General's issuance of a consumer report stating that these are fake clinics that are actually harming women and not providing care. And so that's directly under Governor Walz administration. So yeah, it's really heartbreaking, Sophia. They say they're the party of choice, and yet they don't seem to care to try to provide options to women in need.
Absolutely. I recently a California legislature, they said this about California, and I think the same could be said about Minnesota. He was simply saying that California claims to be a pro-choice state, but in reality, they have the least choices available. Same
Right.
for Minnesota. It is abortion and abortion only.
That's right.
These pregnancy resource centers, they provide fully free services to the mothers, the fathers, and the babies, children, families in need. And so this is, Becca, as you said, a direct result of Governor Walz and his administration basically saying you can either have an abortion or we're not helping you. And
Right.
we can only imagine that he's not going to all of a sudden change if he gets into office when it comes to the White House. We're going to see the same kind of type of administration duplicated there, because these are obviously his values, and his values thus far through this conversation are pro-abortion and anti-women. And with that, as we're wrapping up this abortion topic and we're going to get into this whole gender ideology, Renee, you touched a little bit on that mom's lawsuit. I just want to play a clip. You guys had a great press conference, and a little clip of Renee, of you opening up the press conference that just ended. Like, the line at the end of this video is so good, and so everyone needs to see it. So let's check that out.
Seeking to reinstate common sense health and safety protections for Minnesota women and young girls who may obtain an abortion. The district court's decision to strip the state of nearly all power to regulate abortions or create laws that protect young women, our daughters, picture a 12-year-old, is astounding. These are common sense statutes, again, health and safety protections that have been on the books for decades and were enacted by bipartisan legislature. Minnesota moms are defending the legislature's ability to enact laws regulating abortion, such as informed consent, services from well-trained doctors, and the protection of parental involvement, which simply allows parents to support and talk through a significant medical decision with their minor daughters. The Attorney General has stepped aside, and now Minnesota moms are stepping in.
So good, but that's the reality of it. Administration under Governor Tim Walz means that the moms have to now stop worrying about taking their kids to school, taking them to their practices, putting dinner on the table, keeping track of the household, and now have to step in legislatively to defend women, to defend families, to defend children, and to defend basic rights. That's what's happening in Minnesota, and I believe that's what we would see duplicated by Governor Tim Walz if he gets in as vice president.
Yep, we're seeing that in the abortion industry, in the abortion context, separating children and our daughters at a time when they need their parents most. And we're seeing that, thematically. We're seeing it in the gender ideology too. It's something that we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode. So it's, it's not just a one-stop with that issue. It's pervasive throughout the Walz administration. It's concerning to a lot of parents, and it's very concerning to mothers who really care about their children. I ask myself as a mom, is this the state that I want my daughters to grow up in? Is this the legacy I want for our country? Not really.
Absolutely. And so, with that, the gender issue, it's an issue we see here in California immensely. It's an issue you guys are basically seeing these nearly the same exact bills on this being passed in Minnesota, being signed into law by Governor Walz. And so let's start off with a little clip of him and his whole idea on this.
We mean every single person to feel valued, loved, seen, heard, and respected in the state of Minnesota. So today, I am directing my state agencies to take action to protect and IA plus community. We want every Minnesotan to grow up feeling safe, valued, protected, celebrated, and free to exist as their authentic versions of themselves. Protecting and supporting access to gender-affirming health care is essential to being a welcoming and supportive state to the community. We spoke this morning to a group of folks talking about homelessness amongst our neighbors and our relatives, and this idea of showing grace and kindness, showing those human attributes where every single person is valued. And here in Minnesota, what this is going to mean is we're also going to be good neighbors. Minnesota is seek to provide and to receive gender-affirming health care services. And what that means is by outlawing gender-affirming health care, states across this country are working to prevent necessary evidence-based treatments. We know this urgency is real, thus the need of an executive order today. Now, I want to be clear. I can't pretend to understand what goes through people's minds. I cannot imagine the stress that families and individuals go through. But here in Minnesota, we're going to be a place of refuge to make sure that they feel safe and welcome. And I don't know what a group of people in Pierre who decide to make life miserable and more dangerous for people are thinking, but it's not going to happen in Minnesota. So are to our neighbors. What this means is we will direct our state agencies to have conversations with healthcare providers now to reaffirm that this will be there. We will make sure that we will have no cooperation with states who mean to punish or criminalize. And I think it's very important, and you're going to hear from some of these experts, safe, medically necessary, evidence-based treatments.
So, Becca, you worked a lot the past year and or two, kind of pushing back on this, testifying on this. I want to show a clip of you testifying, but before we get to that, I just want to pinpoint that last line he said, that this is safe, medically tested, all the puberty blockers, the hormones, the treatment, the gender affirming care. And if you're only listening on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, when we say gender affirming care, we're doing air quotes around that because there's nothing caring about that. I mean, there was literally an article, I have it here on my phone, yesterday by the New York Post that says woke doctor refused to publish $10 million trans kids study that showed puberty blockers didn't help mental health. And so we have, and that's just one of the many things, we have evidence that everything Governor Tim Walz said is a lie. We have the stats, and I can link in the show notes the stats that show that suicide ideation actually increases post-transitioning. So he's harming children. Becca, I want to hear all your thoughts on this, but let's kick off with your testimony, and so people can kind of get a gist of where you guys stand.
I work as the Acting Director of Public Policy with Minnesota Family Council. SF 63 takes away custody from parents or guardians who withhold permission of their children to be put on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery on sex organs. Experimental surgeries remove teenagers' healthy sex organs or attempt to construct sex organs which do not work. Experimental use of hormones leaves children partially or fully sterilized. Let's take a brief look into puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones specifically. The Office of the U.S. Surgeon General reports, sex hormones are extremely important in regulating the growth of the skeleton and maintaining the mass and strength of bone. A longitudinal study of a pubertal person undergoing hormonal treatment found that after 28 months of treatment, speed processing and memory of the patient were lower than before hormonal treatment. Loss of sexual function, bone density, and interference with brain development are just a few of the risks that puberty blockers pose for children who are told that this is a simple pause on puberty. Not only that, but in a clinical study of 70 children who were taking puberty blockers, all 70 of them later took cross-sex hormones. The National Health Service, NHS, of the UK claims cross-sex hormones cause some irreversible changes, and long-term cross-sex hormone treatment may cause temporary or even permanent infertility. Knowing that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones can lead to these side effects, let's look at the text of the bill, SF 63 at line 2.28. So this is existing statute. A court of the state has temporary emergency jurisdiction if the child is present in the state. And then new text that would be added to statute is in line 3.3, and the child has been unable to obtain gender-affirming health care. A whistleblower who identifies as a queer woman from St. Louis worked for 4 years at the Washington University Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital. In her story, which broke yesterday, she shared, "The doctors I worked alongside at the Transgender Center said frequently about the treatment of our patients, 'We are building the plane as we are flying it.' No one should be a passenger on that kind of aircraft," she said. Under SF 63, parents lose custody rights if they make decisions based on concern for bone density and sexual function of their teenage daughter. From my reading, the bill isn't clear whether Minnesota parents also lose custody of children seeking access to these drugs without their permission, or if custody revocation only applies to parents from outside the state of Minnesota. Members, based on today's short analysis of scientific research, I'm asking you to vote no on SF 63. And if you'd like to see my research, I'm happy to email it to members of the committee.
So Becca, you let them know the truth of the bill. So
Right.
catch us up to date on where that's at, what Governor Tim Walz, if he signed
Right.
it, what's going on.
Absolutely. Well, this whole bill that they call the trans refuge bill, but we call here in Minnesota the kidnapping bill, was really cloaked under providing kids with medical care. But if you look at the text of the bill, it did a variety of broad sweeping things. One of the main issues is that it changed the grounds for courts to take temporary emergency jurisdiction of children from their parents. So a court might take temporary jurisdiction to determine custody placement if there's evidence of abuse or neglect from parents to children. But this adds a third category in Minnesota law for courts to take temporary emergency jurisdiction, and that is that the child has been unable to obtain, quote, gender affirming care, unquote. And so this is really, I think this is the perfect example of an anti-parent, anti-mother statute. Parents have significant concerns about this so-called gender affirming care, how it impacts not only your sexuality, but also your brain development and your bone development. And I think a lot of mothers across the country have this concern. And so now the government of Minnesota can take temporary emergency jurisdiction for custody placement determinations. And we know exactly where our government stands on this issue. As Governor Tim Walz stated, he directed his Department of Health to show how so-called gender affirming care is safe, and will not respect other laws of the state regarding other states in the union regarding this issue. And so our state really exists to protect this for children and protect the government's push to ensure that kids get on these drugs, which can sterilize them. Honestly, I think you'd have a harder time finding an anti-mother, anti-parent law than this one. It's really horrific, Sophia. And actually, shout out to California Family Council for explaining this bill to me before I saw it come to Minnesota. So unfortunately, I'm sorry that you had to bear it first, but we weren't too surprised when we saw it come up early in session in 2023.
Absolutely. And those of you from California that are listening, that you're probably familiar when we went through this fight with our SB 107. Of course, one of the leaders on that, Senator Scott Wiener, making this whole trans refuge state of California make sure to affirm these confused children. And like Becca said, this is anti-family, anti-mother, anti-women. I mean, this also, once you start opening up the door saying, we're welcoming all the confused people here, we're going to take all the children, put them on all these drugs. I mean, think about these young girls that one day when they wake up and recognize what they've done to their bodies, it's probably going to be too late, and they're going to recognize they're never going to be able to have children. Or if they are, we're going to see situations like Chloe Cole, the detransitioner, where she said, I don't know if I can have children one day. I pray and hope I can. But if I can, I know I'll never breastfeed them because my state allowed me to get a double mastectomy at 15 years old. This is anti-woman, to allow women to destroy and surgically destroy through medicine our healthy, natural, normal bodies. And so, Renee, you are a lawyer, and there's some family law stuff going on here with all this gender ideology. Get us up to date on that.
This law, Sophia, certainly leverages parents against children. The family law system is actually designed for reunification. Families are supposed to be together, and the courts are designed to help keep families together. But in fact, this law rips them apart. I said thematically, that's what we're seeing. Parents versus children at a time when children need their parents most. This will put children into the system, and after the temporary emergency jurisdiction, they might be considered child in need of protective services, which then funnels them in to the system in which they could be out of their parents' home. We have worked with family law attorneys on this bill to make sure that we are accurate. It's very convoluted and complicated. Also, just high level on this bill, they are ignoring court orders, court custody orders from other states. They're also ignoring subpoenas. There's a ton of constitutional violations here with respect to this bill. So it's certainly unlawful, it's arguably unconstitutional, and it really is anti-family. But something that I was thinking about, and I have been thinking about quite a bit over the last two sessions, is just the pervasive attack on families through this forced and compelled acquiescence of gender ideology. And I've got a couple of years on you ladies as far as where I'm at in my season of life. And I can remember in 2014 when I testified at the Minnesota Department of Education, when the Minnesota State High School League first introduced their changes to their processes and procedures to allow men to compete in women's sports. Well, everybody thought this was crazy. Where was this coming from? But really, that was the first kind of litmus test that we saw with the state pushing trans ideology. Well, it's come full circle to where not only do we have this law, but we have another law that's consequential, and I would say really bolsters the effect of the so-called trans refuge bill. It's the counseling censorship bill, which prohibits mental health providers or counselors or anybody else under statute who's considered a mental health provider from helping children reconcile their heart and their mind with their biological sex. So they can push people into sterilization, into medicalization, into cross-sex hormones, into puberty blockers, but they can't have conversations, just talk about reconciling your heart and your mind with your biological sex. When we think about girls, we think of the pervasiveness of rapid onset gender dysphoria, as Abigail Schreier has documented and many others. We see studies of that. So when girls are simply struggling with their body and they just need to talk through it, if they bring up the issue of transgender or gender identity or sexual orientation, that is now unlawful in the state of Minnesota. And not only that, but it is considered deceptive trade practices. So now we're saying these counselors are essentially selling snake oil, and they're going to have the penalties of the law go after them if, again, they just have talk therapy. We are now prohibiting children from talking about their feelings with counselors. I think this would be a good time for me to say, any Minnesota counselors that are watching and have concerns about this, please do call me. You can reach out at info@truenorthlegal.org, and I'm happy to explain more to you. But we're seeing, again, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it wasn't as if transgender refuge bill suddenly appeared out of nowhere. We saw men and women's sports. We see the counseling censorship ban. We actually have a lawsuit now at the Minnesota Supreme Court where a male is trying to compete in the female powerlifting with the USAPL. He is suing and has made it to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Walz's Department of Human Rights filed an amicus brief, which is a friend of the court, in support of the man who says that he has a right to compete in women's sports. They are erasing women by all means. And so again, the facts speak for themselves. I'm not sure how Walz or his administration or the policies that have been passed and even the lawsuits that are going on would demonstrate a pro-women Minnesota.
Absolutely. It's clear we have at this point a side that is willing to say men and males don't belong in females' spaces, in their locker rooms, in their bathrooms, in their sports teams. And yet we have Governor Tim Walz, who's on this whole I'm Coach Walz, coach this, coach that. I hope that I'm grateful that I had great coaches growing up, that growing up I didn't have to deal with this gender ideology. But I pray that my future kids' coaches would stand against a naked boy in the girls' locker room. Any good coach is there to protect his players, to teach his players, to help them get better on whatever sport they're playing, but also how to recognize that those turn also into life lessons. And any man that's okay with a male being in a woman's locker room, like we've heard the stories that we have had literal naked men, fully intact genitalia exposed in front of women and girls. Any man that's okay with that obviously isn't protecting women, and that's what we're seeing in the state of Minnesota. And Renee, with that, we're also seeing some situations happening on where there's with youth service organizations, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, what's going on there?
Well, also part of the Take Pride Act, which had a lot of these gender policies in it, repealed protections for youth service organizations. Like you said, you're correct. Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, 4-H clubs, but often those clubs will pick mentors or people to hire based on their sex. Girl Scouts want to hire female mentors and female leaders. Boy Scouts the same. But unfortunately, the law that allows them to do that so that they wouldn't be in violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which does not allow discrimination based on sex, there was this exception, saying, hey, it's okay for these situations. This is appropriate to say women only. Well, that law was repealed. So now will we have men who identify as women, applying to be Girl Scout troop leaders? I mean, is that pro-women? Is that who we want, saying this is the best example of what a woman can be and who she can be? A woman can't become a man. So it's nonsensical, and it really isn't fair to women, and it's certainly not fair to girls.
Absolutely. A key angle in this issue that I don't think a lot of people recognize is the religious liberty angle here. And that we should have this religious liberty. And so for anyone that's listening in right now, that's like, hey, I'm agreeing with you guys on the gender thing, but I'm an atheist, or I'm not a Christian, or I'm not that. Let's put that aside right now, because no matter what your religion is, no matter what your beliefs are, there's a reason we should have a religious liberty. And when that gets stripped, we're seeing this whole gender ideology, again, put girls in danger. What is going on with religious liberty in Minnesota under Governor Tim Walz?
Well, you're right, Sophia, and I'm really glad that you raised the issue that this is something that everyone should be concerned about, because this affects all Minnesotans and the freedom for all Minnesotans. If we can actually take away religious liberty from individuals, we can take away all sorts of freedoms from all sorts of people. And so specifically in this context, the Minnesota Human Rights Act protects against discrimination based on certain categories as applied to certain individuals: sex, age, religion, etc. And in 1993, protections based on sexual orientation were added to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. But what was also added was an exemption for religious organizations, because those two things can come into conflict. A lot of religious organizations have different beliefs, particularly about human sexuality and about their views on men and women. So the statute was essentially embracing pluralism, kind of a, hey, you do your thing, we'll do our thing over here as religious organizations, and we'll live in one happy Minnesota. Well, unfortunately, that exemption was repealed from state law, which was disastrous. And how does this relate to women? Well, a lot of faith-based organizations actually protect women by housing victims of human trafficking in female-only spaces. And they can do that under that exemption that allows them to, because they're doing it based on their religious beliefs. What about other victims of sexual abuse? What about other victims of domestic abuse? We're talking about women, girls, young children, and families, where these religious organizations could act and care for them consistent with their religious beliefs because of this exemption. Well, when that exemption was removed, what happens to those organizations? Would some organization that houses women who are victims of trafficking be forced to hire a male who identifies as a female? Well, without that exemption, That's very likely. Thankfully, at the end of session, that exemption was restored. It was a hard-fought battle by many groups, many allies, and many legislators. But the point that I've made, Sophia, is that in Minnesota, we should never have to fight that hard for our fundamental freedoms, for our First Amendment rights, when in fact, even the Minnesota Constitution affords us even greater protections under our Minnesota Constitution for religious freedom. It's just something that we shouldn't have to go through. It's not efficient government. And it also is telling it what the Walz administration thinks about gender ideology. That right, essentially to them, supersedes every other right and every other protected category in Minnesota. So you either have to toe the line with gender ideology or take the consequences. That's not really pro-women in my mind.
Absolutely not. And Becca, you are like me, you're in your mid-20s, you're figuring out all this stuff, the attack on women and all that. How do you feel about this, knowing that you are living in a state that if you have daughters one day, they're not going to be protected? Where do you stand as a woman in Minnesota? How does this make you feel?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, as you see all these laws or all these policies that eventually become law or that get debated and just barely don't pass, it's very concerning. And you really have to fight feelings of fear. Speaking honestly and truthfully, I'm a Christian. I believe God's all in control, and none of this is a surprise to him. So I don't want to be afraid. But it does make me wonder, is this going to be a safe place to raise children? It's one thing when it's just you and you can advocate for yourself. And it's another thing to think about bringing children, and especially daughters, but sons too, into a place where you have people who can identify as whatever so-called gender they wish, and have the rights to any of these female-only spaces or child-only spaces. And that actually brings me to a proposed constitutional amendment. If that's good with you, Sophia, I wanted to talk a bit about our Equal Rights Amendment, which almost passed, which would have eventually put it forth to Minnesota voters either in this election or in the 2026 election. The ERA is something that comes up federally and also at different state governments within the state level to change the state constitutions to grant constitutional protection to abortion and also gender. The Minnesota ERA that was being debated would also have given constitutional protection to gender expression, which is very broad and not defined very clearly. And so what would that mean in practice? Well, it would mean that every individual has the right to define their own gender and whatever that means to them. And so we're concerned that would mean you'd have constitutional protection to women's only spaces, like Renee mentioned about women only shelters or locker rooms, or certainly athletic teams as well. And then it's also our interpretation and many others' interpretation that this would grant constitutional protection to so-called gender affirming care and also abortion funded by taxpayer funding, all for adults, children, whomever. Again, this really pits children against parents, saying that every individual has the constitutional protected right to so-called gender affirming care. And we see that as harmful to those children because it takes the parents out of the equation and just puts kids in with this so-called gender affirming care industry or the abortion industry without the protection of their parents who have raised them and protected them, and instead puts them in the hands of these industries which are seeking to profit off people in vulnerable situations. And thankfully that did not pass. It's a long story, Sophia, but thankfully they ran out of time, and we fully expect to see it again in future sessions. That's the thing with state government, is if something doesn't pass in one session, depending upon the political makeup of the legislatures in the future sessions, we expect to see it again. And so we'll keep fighting for the protection of women and children in this area. But we're really thankful that the ERA did not pass the legislature. And so voters in Minnesota won't be seeing it, at least in this election, Sophia. So we're thankful for that.
Well, Becca, great news that it didn't get through the legislature to be on the ballot for voters. I know the two of you worked very hard to push against that and stand up to protect women and children and families. I mean, this even affects little boys that are stuck in this whole confusion. Yeah. But for those that are listening that aren't too familiar with the process of the legislature and how things get onto the ballot, is this not on the ballot this year because Governor Tim Walz said, no, I don't want this? Is he against this? Is that why this didn't get through? What happened with that?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Sophia. Constitutional amendments are tricky because it's my understanding that every state has its own process. In Minnesota, proposed constitutional amendments, the endpoint is voters in an election. So voters determine whether to change the state constitution, but it first has to pass both chambers of the legislature, so the Minnesota House of Representatives, the Minnesota Senate, but then normal law would be signed into law by the governor. In Minnesota, constitutional amendments, they go right from the legislature to voters. And so there were some background issues, Sophia, as to why the ERA did not get passed in its most current form through the Minnesota Senate. Some of that we think involves lack of protections for religious freedom. There was concern from some of the members of the Senate, but also so they had limited time at the end of session. They determined their priorities, and I think this kind of allowed them to sort of wipe away this priority of the ERA because there were concerns from voters and from some of the old school Democrats. Why aren't we protecting religious freedom? Governor Walz has said publicly that he is supportive, but his say in this is not quite as relevant since he won't be politically involved quite as much. But we do know that he is in favor of this based on how his governmental agencies have acted with regard to this issue of gender and certainly abortion. And then also how he's reacted on these issues in signing other bills into law. And so we really have no doubt with his position on the ERA.
And Becca had mentioned that the religion piece, and I don't know, just to clarify that too, is that there wasn't any mention of protections explicitly for religion or creed. So now we have women who are concerned about this. We have parents, mothers particularly, who are concerned about unfettered access to abortion enshrined in a state constitution, which is kind of like a super law when it comes to legal challenges. And then we had no protections for religion. You'll see in some constitutional amendments with ERA, you'll see the word creed. This didn't even have the word creed, which we think is a lesser standard. And as I said, it didn't have the word religion. So I ended up testifying again, to restore our religious protections in the Minnesota Department of Human Rights statutory bill a couple of days before this ERA was dropped, and there was no protections for religious organizations. So I say that because it kind of illustrates the dual path and the confusion of where Governor Walz actually stands when he makes a commitment. So he enacts a bill that says, yes, we'll restore religious protections. And then days later, they drop the Equal Rights Amendment, which has no religious protections at all, which would eviscerate these protections that we work so hard to get back. So it kind of illustrates the process that we've gone through. There is a swift process, very little notice, and a lot of confusion. I would say not a lot of transparency. And I know people watching this think, well, that's politics. But I think it varies between state and between administration and between who is the majority in the House and in the Senate. That legislative composition is going to determine the pace of things. And here, Minnesotans, particularly women and girls that wanted to be vocal about their concerns, didn't have a lot of lead time or opportunity to express their concerns about such consequential legislation and even a potential constitutional amendment.
Absolutely. And so we've walked through that under the Walz administration in Minnesota, unrestricted abortion at any point, women are not being taken care of. Moms are not getting the maternal help they need for different products. We're watching you guys become a sanctuary state for trans ideology, for young children to get their bodies mutilated and sterilized. We're watching religious liberty kind of go out the door, and which is leading to, as we were talking about earlier, Renee, issues with homeless shelters, domestic abuse shelters, and men being put into these women's spaces. We now are seeing you guys fight against this whole ERA, and like you said, Becca, probably continuing to fight against that and seeing that pop up in a few further years. So with that, Becca, is Governor Tim Walz a pro-women candidate?
Right. Well, I think that he's tried to make so much of his political run based on this notion of empathy. But when you look at what he has supported, it's been things that pad the abortion industry and this so-called gender affirming care industry. And because he uses this platitude of empathy and care, it can be easy to kind of not look any deeper. But when we look at what these laws have done, we see that they protect these industries rather than Minnesotans, whether it be men, women, mothers, fathers, children. All of these have really protected these industries, Sophia. And so I would say very clearly, no, these have not been actually protecting women. And I think it's really concerning, Sophia, that he has played off people's fears to try to offer these laws as like the savior, when in fact these industries are preying off people, especially women in vulnerable positions and children as well. And so I think we can say pretty confidently that that's not the case. So we're highly concerned about these laws.
Absolutely. It's unfortunate to watch, kind of like you said, the feeding off people's fears and the
Right.
lies coming through this. As we wrap up here, I'd love for you both to kind of give any final words and thoughts, and also maybe where people can find out more about Minnesota family policy, your social media, your Twitter, whatever you want to share. We'll also put that all in the show notes, but so people can find out more about what you guys are doing. Renee, let's kick it off with you.
Well, thanks for having us. I think that we need to take a hard look at what's happened in Minnesota as something that could happen across the country. And as an attorney from True North Legal, I'm not making an endorsement for any candidate or about any candidate here. I mean, frankly, if I could just speak to everybody listening, as a Minnesotan and as a mom, I can say that I have strong concerns raising my children in a state that, as Becca said, is exploiting children and is medicalizing children. The abortion industry is being padded by Governor Walz policies, as Rebecca stated. I mean, we're seeing it before our eyes. So it's not a place of safety and security. Governor Walz says that everyone is welcome here, but what it seems like is everyone that agrees with the government's position is welcome here. They're driving diverse views out of the marketplace. You're not allowed to have a different decision about gender ideology. Those of us that think that there are actual men and women and that sex is binary don't seem to be welcome in this state. I've had to defend parents with their simple right to opt their children out of forced gender ideology and curriculum in our public schools. I've talked to women who have actually had abortions here in the state of Minnesota and didn't feel like they could find other options. So we have lots of ways how we could promote family flourishing and support women, children, and others here in the state of Minnesota. But as I've said, Governor Walz's record seems to speak for itself. There's not a lot of inferences or policies that I can find that would lead me to believe that having him in the Oval Office, having him as the Vice President of the United States would make for a pro-woman or pro-girl, pro-female America. So again, that's just me, Sophia, as Renee Carlson here, at Renee K. Carlson, my own words, my own tweets right here, not True North Legal. But that's what I take from this in my holistic experience here in Minnesota and in public policy and in law.
Like I said, we do have big concerns about Governor Walz and how he has really sought to pass these laws that protect the abortion industry. In fact, there's a viral video of him going around saying that Nancy Pelosi said he was too pro-abortion, and he said, "I stand with Planned Parenthood." I think that's the most honest thing maybe I've seen from him. Yeah, he really stands with these industries and not as much with the people of Minnesota on these social issues. At the same time, I don't want to just share this message of doom and gloom. I do believe that there's only so much time that he can get away with this. The truth is coming to light, and especially with him running now for vice president, the truth is coming to light, and people are getting aware of these evil policies and need to keep talking about them. Where can people find out more about our organizations and our work? You can go to mfc.org. You can find us on social media. We're on Twitter. We're also on Instagram. If you want to find Renee and I, our personal Instagrams, I'm at Becca_Delahunt, and Renee is at Renee K. Carlson. Yeah, you can interact with us there. We also have a podcast that you can find on any podcast platform that you listen to, our organization. So thank you so much, Sophia, for asking us these great questions and wanting to know more about Governor Tim Walz.
Well, thank you both so much for being on. And I just want to emphasize, as Renee stated, This podcast episode is not to endorse any candidates, not even saying who to vote for or not vote for, but it is to bring to light the truth of what is happening in the state of Minnesota under Governor Walz administration. So thank you both for being on. And like I said earlier, check the show notes to see everywhere they said on where to follow them, links to all of the different legislation, the ERA, all the things we talked about. And we will see you all next time.